A shocking first for the pachinko genre on NES Works Gaiden Casio.
President Reagan from Barbados early this morning, he says at the request of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States.
Friends, it's finally happened. In Pachinko-UFO for Casio PV1000, I finally found a pachinko video game that I actually kind of like. Alert the press. There is, admittedly, only so much you can do with a pachinko video game, especially on 8-bit hardware. The entire concept is fundamentally unsound. A pachinko video game attempts to recreate a real-world gambling experience that offers very little real interactivity and lacks the surreptitious back-alley prize redemption component of the actual game. Pachinko as a real-world activity is interesting because of the subtle, chaotic physics involved in firing those little steel balls upward and attempting to fine-tune their path into the various targets scattered around the board as they bounce unpredictably off the pegs built into the background. An 8-bit rendition of Pachinko obviously can't reproduce these complexities in 8 kilobits of code or whatever. But Pachinko-UFO at least manages to bring an element of skill into the game over the various other Pachinko sims that have popped up here over the years, with a simple, creative choice: the way you launch the ball. In all of the other games we've seen here, from Sega's Pachinko to Pachinko Time, what passes for gameplay amounts to holding down the action button to fire off steel balls while using the control stick or joypad to nudge their trajectory. It's not actually all that involving, although I suppose it has the advantage of being accurate to the meat-space machines. Pachinko-UFO dares to be different by focusing its play around the action button. Rather than holding down the button to launch an endless stream of balls, you press and release the button for each ball you fire off. The longer you hold the button, the further you launch the ball. This is a pretty subtle distinction from the usual, but it makes a big difference. It keeps Pachinko-UFO from feeling like a mindless exercise in holding down a button for autoplay, and turns every shot into a test of timing. The difference between a perfect shot and one that goes to waste is a matter of milliseconds, and even then you have to contend with the random nature of the way balls bounce off of pegs, not to mention the dynamic UFO-themed elements that spin up to keep things lively. I'm not saying that I'd necessarily seek out Pachinko-UFO of my own volition, but if someone forced me at gunpoint to pick an 8-bit Pachinko title to play, I'd definitely go with Casio's game. I'd also have to ask why someone would force me to play Pachinko games under threat of gangland-styled execution. I guess that's just the way of things these days. Admittedly, this is not the best 8-bit Pachinko sim. That honor goes to Casio's PV2000 rendition of Pachinko-UFO, which carries forward the same gameplay mechanics and design of this release, but with a better color palette and much smoother animation for the steel balls. Not having played that version myself, I have to assume that the finer, more granular ball movement translates into more dynamic play physics. But if nothing else, the gentle TMS 9918 color palette makes it much prettier than the eyesore that you inevitably get with a PV1000 game. Anyway, I think I stated back in Gaiden that Pachinko for SG-1000 was the first proper Pachinko game released for a console. The pinball-like Pachinko for Odyssey 2 does not count. But from what I can tell, Sega's Pachinko debuted in December 1983, while Casio dumped the entire PV1000 inventory onto the market in October 1983. So that would make this the first proper console Pachinko sim. Does anyone care? God, I hope not. But it does prove what we've suspected all along. If the best video Pachinko game was the first video Pachinko game, that means the entire genre was all downhill. Next up, we have something equally notable: a rare console port of one of gaming's most influential and groundbreaking games. Universal's Space Panic laid the groundwork for the entire platformer genre, but it only showed up on 2 consoles back in the day. One of those consoles was the PV1000 here, which means that it really only effectively saw play on ColecoVision. People owned that console, unlike Casio's system, which Video Game Kraken claims was discontinued within weeks of shipping. That puts it on par with the tenure of a modern Tory Prime Minister. That's a joke for my British viewers. But seriously, folks, Universal is one of those incredibly important game companies from the late 1970s and early 1980s whose work had tremendous reach and impact in arcades, but which has largely been forgotten in the modern era. Universal's work as a coin-op manufacturer tapered off around the same time that the US arcade and console market crashed. So, when the NES refreshed the industry here in the States, the work of companies like this ended up being left behind as relics of an earlier era. Gaming tastes changed. Game design grew more complex. and the rights to those creations either lapsed or ended up mired in the possession of corporations that had left the industry behind and don't see the value in jumping through the legal hoops of setting up licensing arrangements. Of course, we're talking about the Casio PV-1000 here, so the concurrent collapse of the American market doesn't factor into this Japan-exclusive system's demise. That happened independently of those overseas crises. It's just that the American NES launch served as a sort of refresh, and it makes a convenient, though hardly absolute, cutoff point when looking back at history. And let's be honest, the American NES launch might never have happened if Space Panic never existed. The PV-1000 cartridge, which plays fine, has nothing whatsoever to do with this premise. The NES's Japanese counterpart Famicom had already shipped in Japan by the time the PV-1000 showed up. This actually gets to the heart of why PV-1000 likely did jack squat in terms of sales. It just couldn't compete with Nintendo's system. Not only on a technical level, in which there's honestly no comparing the two machines, Famicom was a generation ahead in terms of audio, visual, and other technical capabilities, but more to the point in terms of content. PV-1000 had Space Panic. Famicom had Donkey Kong. That's the point where Casio execs looked at the state of electronics shop shelves, compared their work to Nintendo's, and sadly mused, we've got a kill screen coming up. Universal, and specifically designer Kazutoshi Ueda, who gave us the charming Ladybug, or Fighting Bug if you're nasty, unleashed Space Panic upon arcades back in late 1980. Ueda took his inspiration from a game you may have heard of somewhere along the way, a little trap-em-up called, yes, Heiankyo Alien. Heiankyo Alien allegedly took some cues in turn from the movie Alien. Honestly, I don't know if that influence only goes so far as including the stylized English word alien in the title, or extends all the way into its gameplay, but I could certainly believe the latter. It was a passive game in which you avoided and trapped marauding aliens, rather than confronting them head-on, which evoked Ripley's dash to the life pod at the end of the film. Space Panic seemingly draws on its own inspirations beyond Heiankyo Alien. For starters, it really only carries forward Heiankyo's central premise: avoid aliens, dig holes, trap the bad guys. You need to scramble around the screen using your shovel to dig holes that pursuing creatures will fall into. It takes 3 pokes of the shovel to dig a proper hole. If you don't take the time to dig a full hole, an alien won't fall into the crater you've dug once it hits it, but will instead stop at its edge and fill it in to create safe passage for itself. Once an alien does drop into one of the holes you've created, you can delete it from the universe by dashing over to the hole and quickly filling it in. The aliens, or at least the first wave of aliens, look an awful lot like the red monster from Heiankyo Alien clone Pac-Man, except that each one has a pair of antennae on its head, which it can use to grasp the edges of a hole that it falls into. So by filling in a hole that has caught an alien, you're effectively piling dirt over its head to weigh it down and cause it to lose its grip, plunging to the level below. The fall kills the monster, at least until you start facing more advanced alien forms in the later levels. The blue monsters can endure a single fall, while the white ones, which are curiously redolent of both alien headcrab larvae from the movie and Nintendo's future Metroids, can shrug off 2 drops. And the idea of dropping and plunging gets to the core of what makes Space Panic different and distinct from Heiankyo Alien. It's a platform game, arguably the first ever. Unlike Heiankyo Alien, Space Panic doesn't take place from a top-down viewpoint, but rather from a fixed side-on perspective. Space, in Space Panic, consists of a series of 6 parallel tracks of horizontal ground, all linked by ladders that you can climb and descend. These parallel tracks never change, but the placement of ladders varies from level to level, forcing you to navigate each stage differently and adjust your strategies. Notably, ladders only exist to allow you and the aliens to climb from one platform to another. You can't actually dig with your shovel on a ladder. This immediately distinguishes the game flow and strategic options available in Space Panic from those of Heiankyo Aliens. With its top-down structure, the latter game allowed both horizontal and vertical lanes of movement to come into play as spaces where you can potentially trap aliens, and some strategies revolve around digging at junctions. In Space Panics, ladders put you strictly on the defensive. You really only want to climb them as necessary to evade monsters or to move to a different level of platforms, because being on a ladder leaves you vulnerable. Digging holes becomes a proposition strictly for the horizontal axis of movement, so you can only dig holes to your left or right, and only when standing on a platform. Although this does impose more limited tactical variety on you than you find in the central gameplay loop of Heiankyo Alien, Space Panic's introduction of verticality introduces a new consideration: escape routes. The holes you create aren't just for trapping and murdering aliens. In a pinch, you can use them for a quick evasion. Aliens will anchor themselves in a hole to avoid falling through, but you can simply drop directly through a hole to the platform below. This does have some limitations. If you fall onto an alien, whether it's free roaming or trapped in a hole, that's it for you. Still, the option to take the plunge and evade your pursuers means that you have a handy way out if you find yourself surrounded on both sides by monsters, or if you find yourself on the wrong side of a hole with an alien in hot pursuit. I can't help but feel that Space Panic's visual orientation speaks to a source of creative inspiration beyond Heiankyo Alien and, at least in terms of monster design, Pac-Man. After all, back in 1980, when Universal put together Space Panic, you couldn't go to a Japanese game center without spotting a fleet of the country's most popular game of the 1970s, Space Invaders. I don't think it's a coincidence that Space Panic's title begins with the word space. Clearly, Universal was observing the time-honored trend of the sly wink. But more meaningfully, the arcade version of Space Panic involves a vertically oriented screen where players start at the bottom of the screen and need to defend against aliens approaching from above. Heck, the bottom of the screen here even represents a sort of space you want to avoid allowing the aliens to claim. While the game doesn't end if they reach the bottom as it does in Space Invaders, it's only game over when you allow them to catch your little shovel man too many times, the lowest platform is a sort of indefensible area. You can't dig holes in the lowest level, and you clearly can't drop down below the bottom. So if you end up trapped down there with the aliens, it's bad news. Same as if the invaders reach the ground. I'm not saying that Ueda sat down and deliberately set out to rip off two popular arcade games, but you can see their influence writ large here. And that's totally okay. Sometimes great ideas come from strategic borrowing, and Space Panic adds something new to the stew of its ingredients. Well, that's probably understating it. Space Panic pretty much invented the platform genre. If you can't help but look at this game and see Heiankyo Alien and Space Invaders written all over it, you also can't deny the fact that this is a pile of raw components that eventually became Donkey Kong and Lode Runner. Digging holes to trap pursuers and drop to safety? That's pure Lode Runner. And the garish pink ladders that allow you to ascend while avoiding hazards is just straight up Donkey Kong. Heck, a recently translated interview with an engineer from Ikegami Tsushinki, the engineering firm that produced Donkey Kong for Nintendo, revealed the fact that Shigeru Miyamoto's original design doc for the game consisted of a single level concept that more or less looked like a jumbled rearrangement of Space Panic's screen layout. The other three screen types came about as an Ikegami initiative. So it's pretty cool that Casio licensed this landmark creation for play on PV-1000. Not that anyone actually bought the system, but this version is still more accessible than trying to hunt down an original Space Panic PCB. Of course, it also draws a line under the reason that PV-1000 never went much of anywhere. Sure, it had a reasonably faithful version of Space Panic, one that even keeps the oxygen meter that doubles as a time limit. But Nintendo's Famicom had a beautiful take on Donkey Kong, the game that vastly improved on Space Panic's design. Something like a little instant obsolescence. Next time on NES Works Gaiden Casio, a very spicy finale.